A few weeks ago, and I know I'm pretty late getting around to this, but I was on vacation when it happened, but Father James Martin, who probably needs no introduction, had published a fairly lengthy response to Bishop Joseph Strickland from the Diocese of Tyler, Texas, as well as Cardinal Mueller, who is the former prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. I think I said that right. Anyways, they had both very, I would say, gently criticized him. And I mean gently, like Bishop Strickland didn't even name Father Martin. Anyways, they had both fairly gently criticized him for his speaking and writing with respect to LGBTQIP2SAA persons. Now, I haven't read Father Martin's book, so I can't comment on that specifically, but I do sympathize somewhat with, I think, the spirit of whatever it is that I think he's trying to do, assuming that it's well intended. But if he is deliberately trying to undermine church teaching, then I'm with Pope Pius X, who said that priests or individuals working from within the ranks of the church who are trying to compromise or spread confusion about church teaching are among the most pernicious of the adversaries of the church. And by the way, pernicious is a word I'm going to try and use a lot more often. And this underscores something that's fairly important for me, because I'm not Catholic because I was born into it, or for any of the many reasons that someone might assume that identity. I'm Catholic because I first became convinced that God exists, and then I became convinced that God became incarnate through the person of Jesus Christ. And then I became convinced that Jesus established a church and handed on his authority to it so that it would persist to the end of the age. And then I became convinced that the Catholic Church has the best claims to actually being that church. And it was at that point that I placed myself under the church's authority. And before I go on, if you're tempted to scoff at that because you want to flatter yourself for being more free-thinking than I am, let me just point out that we are all under someone's authority. 99% of what you know has been taught to you, and you accepted it based on authority. Very few of the things that we know are things that we actually discovered ourselves, independent of anyone else's influence. And most of the time, the authority that we find ourselves under is by accident. We just kind of fell into affiliation, or we signed up for a course somewhere, and that formed us into whatever it is that we happen to believe now. At least I chose my master, which is about as free thinking as it gets. And because I had settled on who my authority was going to be, my intention since then has just been to live that life, to know what the church teaches and to follow it so that I have the best chance of being happy and healthy and living in eternity that way, not to mention the same intentions for my wife and children. But that's not as simple as it may sound, because we now live in an age in the church where there's all these different factions trying to persuade us in different directions. And even among the bishops and cardinals, there are debates about what actually is church teaching. And the crazy thing is this is something we were actually warned about by several popes, including Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius X. They said this day would come. And this is actually fairly easy to confirm historically. Factually speaking, this isn't, tinfoil hat kind of stuff. During the Cold War, there were actually communist agents infiltrating Catholic seminaries to undermine it from within. This was an actual program by the Soviet Union. So it's no wonder that socialist ideas are so popular in the church today, even though socialism, even moderate socialism, was explicitly condemned at a magisterial level long ago. So instead of just knowing what is church teaching and following it, your average Catholic now has to run through this maze of smoke and mirrors just to find out what actually is church teaching long before we can even begin to follow it. So that's why I think it's so important to respond to people like Father James Martin, who are out there teaching things that are at best ambiguous and at worst hostile to Catholic Christianity. So in his reply, Father Martin said that he has not written or spoken against church teaching or contradicted church teaching, and that he will not do so. And he seemed to express a kind of frustration that this reputation of being a dissident has followed him around in his work. And he also pointed out that his book has ecclesial approval from his Jesuit superiors, because he's a Jesuit, and that many bishops and priests have endorsed the book. And based on this, he argues that his work is fully in line with Catholic teaching. But here's a first difficulty. If a cardinal who is an expert on church doctrine, which Cardinal Mueller's credentials insist, says that you have crossed a line on church teaching, and then other bishops say that the opposite is true, how do we know who's right? Because they can't both be. Obviously, someone's wrong, which demonstrates that some bishops can be wrong and heretical. So merely pointing to the endorsement of some bishops doesn't prove that your work is operating within the boundaries of church teaching. He then went on to say that church teaching is the gospel. Church teaching is the example and teachings of Jesus Christ. And I want to read really quickly specifically what he had to say, because I don't want to misrepresent him on this. So he says, quote, "And in the person of Jesus Christ, we see someone who continually reached out to those who felt that they were on the margins, who felt excluded, who felt persecuted." So church teaching is about making those who feel excluded to feel included. End quote. Okay, so I do agree with him up to a point. Jesus did reach out to people who were on the margins, people who were hurting physically and mentally and spiritually, and offered them healing and new life. But what was that new life based on? Father Martin says that church doctrine is about making those who feel excluded included. But that begs the question, what is the inclusion based on? What is the thing that we are including them in? When Jesus reached out to people to offer them a new life, it was always a new life of holiness grounded in truth. Truth is the mechanism that includes us in what Catholicism actually is. And if you're not convinced, take it from Father Martin. Father Martin says that Jesus is the gospel, and Jesus, therefore, is this focal point of inclusion that he's arguing for. Well, what did Jesus call himself? Jesus called himself the truth, and not someone who has the truth or someone who can show you the truth, but that he is truth itself. Jesus always met people where they were at, but he never left them there. He always invited them out of their situation into a life of truth. He said that the truth will set us free. Like when Jesus met the Samaritan woman at the well, which is often cited as an example of Jesus reaching out to someone on the margins, he said that true worshipers of God worship him in spirit and truth, and that this is the kind of follower that God wants. The other thing I find chilling about this is the way that Father Martin kept on downplaying the role of the Catechism. And the Catechism is our reference for what is church teaching, by the way. And he did that in order to go and make a direct appeal to Jesus based on whatever his arguments about who Jesus is and what he did. But the problem is that to be Catholic is to recognize the magisterial authority, the teaching authority of the Catholic Church, because that's the way that Jesus set it up. Using your own interpretation of what Jesus said or what you think he said is the reason why we have thousands of Christian denominations. We don't all get to interpret Jesus for ourselves as Catholics. And if that's what you want, and I can sympathize for why some people do, then at least have the honesty and integrity to go and start your own church. Like, I'm not a big fan of Martin Luther, but at least he had the integrity to go and do that. The other problem with this whole fixation on inclusion is that it's futile. It's logically impossible to include everyone. If you have different groups of people, or even just different people, individuals with different beliefs and different lifestyles, you can't include them all unless it's an inclusion based on relativism, which is completely contrary to the Catholic Church. And the fact that I am someone who feels very excluded from Father Martin's portrayal of Catholicism is evidence of what I'm talking about. True inclusion is based on our own personal reform based on the standard of truth. We all need to be transformed by the teachings of Jesus Christ, which have been transmitted through the ages, through the teaching magisterium of the church. And the Catechism, which Father Martin keeps downplaying, is our reference to what those teachings are. A frequently used analogy to depict how it is that Jesus actually reaches out to us, including those who are on the margins, to rescue us and offer us new life, might be appropriate in this context. Our situation is often compared to that of a person who has been swept up in a raging river. And the turmoil, the rapids of that river are analogous to our own dysfunction and brokenness. They're of our own making. And so Jesus stands on the riverbank and he offers his hand based on his firm footing to rescue us and to take us out of that dysfunction and brokenness and lead us into a new life of holiness grounded in truth. He that is truth. And so we at that point have the option to take his hand and to accept that offer into a new life, or to reject it and say, nah, I'm good with my life and my own design and my identity and whatever it is that I'm doing. My impression of the kind of accompaniment and inclusion that is preached by church leaders like Father Martin is one in which, instead of reaching out our hand to offer to pull people out and rescue them from the source of their own demise, instead, we just give them a high five just as they're going under to affirm them in where they are and what they're doing. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed that, then please consider subscribing and liking, and come find me on Facebook and Twitter. It's a huge help when you do that. It helps us get these videos in front of more and more people. And a big thank you goes out to You Catholic for presenting these videos. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, specializes in branding, web and graphic design, marketing, social media, videography, and all that kind of good stuff. So if you know of a parish, a diocese, a ministry, or a business that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way and I'm sure we can help them out.